Hello. So far, on this channel we've discussed a couple topics. In this channel's first video, we discussed Marx's critique of political economy in relation to Hegel's Science of Logic, especially concerning Capital Volume 1 as a work of so-called systematic dialectic, as well as an exposition of Marx's theory of the value form. In our second video, we took some of these more abstract theoretical points and applied them to three anthropological examples to show how social relations of capitalism alter non-capitalist societies as they emerge. In this video, I hope to cover a couple things, primarily Enlightenment values and how they are realized within capitalism, but only in a certain sense, as well as how capitalism equally fails the realization of Enlightenment's promises, at the same time as it realizes them in a one-sided manner. We will also discuss self-interest and how it is socially conditioned by the relations of society, how what we will call subjective reason shapes and conditions self-interest, as well as the products of subjects in the production process is taken up as moments of capital as social totality. Finally, we'll discuss the purpose of theory and critique in light of these problems. To start with, we'll take a look at Marx's analysis of circulation in capitalist society, and how this surface sphere of circulation realizes some of the promises of Enlightenment, but only when looked at in this one-sided manner. I'd like to make a few points before I begin. Firstly, I'm assuming a systematic dialectic reading of Marx's Capital. An explanation of this, along with a more detailed treatment of Marx's dialectic of the value form, can be found in my first video. But briefly, I'm operating under the assumption that the extrapolation in Capital Volume 1 forms an imminent critique of capitalism's inner logic, not any sort of primarily historical unfolding, with the exception of the end of the book, which is explicitly historical. Capital, generally, can be split into two spheres of logical analysis, that of circulation and production. Circulation is the sphere where Enlightenment ideals are realized, while production, and the corresponding picture of the whole taken into account, shows these ideals to be inverted, once the sphere of production is introduced. Marx begins Capital with an analysis of circulation and exchange in capitalist society. Within this abstract sphere of circulation, each commodity owner engages each other on a free and equal footing, each pursuing their own self-interest. Each owner confronts one another as an owner of their commodity first and foremost, and each of these owners may freely exchange with whoever they please. No one, at this conceptual level, is forced to engage in exchange with anybody else. Each relates only as an owner of their respective commodities and engages freely and equally with all others. In this situation, each truly confronts each other on an equal footing. Unlike, say, the relation of a serf to their lord, commodity owners are not bound by formalized personal relations of domination or obligations to each other. Each acts only as a buyer or seller and is free to dispose of their commodity as they wish to. Thus, an abstract freedom and equality is achieved at this level. No one is bound to any other, and each may engage in as much free exchange of commodities as each is able to. They all possess a formal freedom on the basis of exchange, and no one is bound by any personal form of obligation to each other. Furthermore, each pursues their own interest as an atomized individual. Person A seeks his best interest in exchange as in the market. His engagement with Person B occurs because Person A finds it personally advantageous to engage with him. Each may have something the other wants or needs. The basis of these relationships are also based on the ownership of property. Each formally free and equal individual relates to each other through the ownership of their commodities. Each person acting on this basis pursues their own self-interest in exchange. Each acquires to do what they want or need through the market, and does so on a formally free and equal basis of property relations. Marx notes, at this level of analysis, Enlightenment ideals are truly realized within the market. Each person, as Marx notes, operates according to freedom, equality, property, and bentham. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their own free will. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the form in which they give legal expression to their common will. Equality, because each enters into relation with the other, as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own, and bentham, because each looks only to himself. The only force that brings them together and puts them in relation with each other is his selfishness, the gain and the private interests of each. Each looks to himself only, and no one troubles himself about the rest, and just because they do so, do they all, in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an all-shrewd providence, work together to their mutual advantage, for the common weal and in the interest of all. Or, as Robert Kurz would put it, quote, in buying and selling, there are no masters or slaves, and nobody commands or obeys. There are only free and equal people in the law. The sphere of commodity exchange is a sphere of mutual respect. Where an exchange of a commodity and money takes place, there is no violence. Thus, liberty, equality, and self-interest are all present in circulation. Enlightenment ideals are fully present within this one-sided perspective on modern capitalist society. One theoretical model that attempts to grapple with capitalism at this conceptual level is utility theory. Utility theory centers the concept of so-called utility as something that everything is ultimately reducible to and can be accounted for through. This ends up essentially mirroring Marx's category of value in a totally uncritical manner. Utility, like value, acts as an individual, independent social factor that controls human relations and those involved. Yes, each manages freely with each other, but value or utility reigns as an ultimate third thing that presides over the relations within circulation and reduces everything to a common measurement. Utility, Hegel notes in the Phenomenology of Spirit, acts as a sort of beyond, above social relations that ends up determining them within Enlightenment thought, as a stand-in for substance once Enlightenment has excised faith. Value plays essentially the same role within exchange. It is something that precedes over the exchange relations between commodity owners. Patrick Murray would refer to utility as a so-called shadow form of value, or a sort of ideological ideal projection of the underlying social form of value. But, as we find, the sphere of circulation, while really realizing the ideals of the Enlightenment, do so only in a one-sided way. Once Marx develops the concept of capital and demonstrates that it must engage in the sale and purchase of labor power, a transition occurs into the so-called hidden abode of production, and it is with this transition that these Enlightenment values invert into their opposites, and the seemingly free and equal land of circulation becomes one of social domination. This occurs once capitalist society is considered at the level of the whole, conceptually, or in other words, once society is considered beyond the mere surface level of exchange, and the sphere of production and its relations are taken into full consideration. Capital and value act as abstract forces of social domination, where the producers are dominated by their products, and where social relations between people become relations between things. Furthermore, the relations of free and equal commodity owners becomes a division of those who own and those who ultimately have no real choice but to sell their labor power. Quote, the freedom and equality of circulation are nothing but a mechanism for capital's goal of realization. The equality that asserts itself in the market is the imposition of value over everything and the reducibility of everything to value's price form. As discussed more in my previous video, value imposes a historically specific form of social domination that imposes both an objective social structure onto us and subjective forms of thought. With capital's domination and imposition onto us, the right of property undergoes a so-called dialectical inversion, so that capital, in turn, gains the right to alien product, or, as Adorno notes, quote, the universal domination of exchange value over human beings, which a priori does not permit subjects to be subjects, degrades subjectivity itself to a mere object, relegating that principle of universality, which asserts that it would establish the predominance of the subject, to untruth. With the domination of capital comes what I mentioned above, the imposition of certain forms of subjective thought, which are ultimately grounded in this specific type of society. With value's imposition, that self-interest Marx discusses with his whole freedom, equality, property, and Bentham quote, mentioned earlier, comes forth. But self-interest is not some sort of general trans-historical concept, at least not in any meaningful sense. Sure, we avoid getting eaten by dangerous animals in the wild, and don't actively run ourselves off cliffs. But self-interest is oriented around exchange, money, etc., are socially and historically conditioned. Private interest is socially determined and is always bound up with the production and reproduction of a specific type of society. Self-interest under capitalism mirrors the social relations of capitalism in conditioning the very actions of self-interest in line with the categories of capitalist society. The day-to-day actions and activities of individuals in capitalist society are oriented around historically determined categories which impose certain types of logic onto us. One cannot act freely or fully within one's self-interest without the impositions of modern social categories on their actions, decisions, and thoughts. This occurs both subjectively and objectively. Subjectively, one may or may not recognize the relations at play, or think of the situation in those terms. For example, a local resident of a neighborhood being increasingly priced out of renting where she has always lived may have various factors in why she may or may not want to move. She may resist moving because she has grown up in the neighborhood, has ties to the local community, or if she has children, it may be preferential to stay for the sake of a better public schooling system. She may like the location, may find it convenient for being close to where she works, etc. But ultimately, she is conditioned by the categories of capitalist modernity in this. This is where the crossover to objectively imposed logic emerges. Irregardless of her personal concerns, she is dictated by value relations and the market to leave if she cannot abide by this social force outside herself. She may very well choose to leave on the basis of an economic reasoning, but here, her subjective decision is predicated on the objective social nexus she finds herself wrapped up in. Her movement is not a freely made choice, but one conditioned by a social structure outside herself. This is a rather simple example, but the imposition of social categories on our thinking goes much deeper. If we consider reason to be, in part, fundamental to ourselves as humans, we are increasingly subjected to the drive of what Max Horkheimer would call subjective reason. Subjective reason is ultimately an imposed reason of capital onto subjects, and in turn hollows out reason as an end in itself. Reason is increasingly formalized to accord and reconcile to the existing society's abstract impulses. Horkheimer writes, quote, "In the end, no particular reality can seem reasonable per se. All the basic concepts, emptied of their content, have come to be only formal shells. As reason is subjectivized, it also becomes formalized. The acceptability of ideals, the criteria for our actions and beliefs, the leading principles of ethics and politics, all our ultimate decisions are made to depend upon factors other than reason." While reason could be said to be objective in other social orders, in that reason could concern itself with larger questions of what is good, right, true, etc., reason increasingly becomes instrumentalized to questions and concerns surrounding capitalist society. It loses autonomy and becomes an instrument. In science, positivism, one of Horkheimer and Adorno's main targets, becomes a philosophy of mere replication of what is. No question is asked in a positive social science as to what should be, or a deeper understanding of why things are as they are. Instead, reason remains at the level of appearance, and churns out so-called facts, stripped of theory. Without theory, one could not properly link the decisions of individuals to the circumstances of the whole, not in a meaningfully concrete way at least. As Adorno writes, quote, "We should not content ourselves with recording what people think, want, and do of their own accord, but rather, while still recording what they think, want, and do, and certainly acquainting ourselves with it, we should at all times see it in relation to the objective circumstances." While reason taken as an end in itself may value the development of the individual, the pursuit of a passion or skill, subjective reason, in contrast, of capitalist modernity, imposes on us desires and wants that are attached to alienated social structures. Advertisements provide new objects to ogle at, and consumerist impulses lead us to purchase for its own sake. Beyond the consumption of totally irrelevant use values, the acquisition of commodities for their exchange value alone becomes an object of desire. The concern becomes what the thing represents on the market, and not what it means for people. Reason, when it is not taken as an end in itself, is instead fully subordinated to the alien social process. Concepts instead becomes a mean to an alien end. Solutions to problems for what is ultimately, at the end of the day, capital's concerns. As Marx grasped clearly in his dealings with real subsumption, technology becomes a tool for capital's self-valorization. The products of reason become a means for capital accumulation at the expense of all else. A contemporary example of such use of technology would be much of modern social media. The pinnacle of today's social media, and what the various social media companies now attempt to copy, is found in something like TikTok. I don't use this example in any way to try to come off as just complaining about the kids these days, but I think it can serve as a real microcosm into the social whole. A whole range of technological developments are brought together in this app. Its use of the internet, live video sharing, various editing softwares, cell phones, etc. These all amount to a large amalgamation of technological innovations. What's the result? One of the most highly addictive social media platforms that has ever been created. But this addictive element is actively encouraged. The longer users remain on the site, the more advertisements they are engaged with, and the greater possibility of purchasing products through the app. Other social media apps now follow this trend. For example, YouTube now has YouTube Shorts, and has a page to live feed you these TikTok-esque style videos. The style of social media is one of the most conducive to engagement, the most addictive, and the most likely to get users to see and purchase ads. It is common, in fact, to see brands copy whatever the latest trend on TikTok is, and it blurs the line between the strictly user-created content and advertisers. All of these factors don't just occur because a conscious decision was made in a free manner. These decisions were made under the logic of value, under the dictates of formalized subjective reason. TikTok is made the most addictive platform, and others follow suit, because it shows itself to be the most lucrative of the bunch. It gets the most engagement, the most investment, and the most ad payoffs. To blame technology here would be misguided. Technology alone did not render these decisions. These decisions were made, but they were made under the guiding force of value production. If your goal as a firm is the greatest boosting of profit, why would you not make the most addictive, attention span destroying product you could? Of course, the social relations of capitalism are self-obfuscating, so many find it easier to blame technology in and of itself instead of the social forms it finds itself under. Technology, if under a different social formation, oriented towards different purposes, could be highly liberating. But the critique of capitalist categories and social forms is often misplaced in one way or another. Technology itself often is one of these misplaced critiques. Under capital, quote, reason has become an instrument. Its operational value, its role in the domination of men and nature, have been made the sole criterion. Returning again to the realm of self-interest at the level of the individual, as our neighborhood resident was, the logic of capitalist categories affects significant life choices of individuals too. Again, the subjective thoughts of individuals and objective social structure cannot really be separated here. Decisions in one's personal life are guided by considerations of attempting to adapt and integrate into the current social order as best as one can. The individual replicates what is in his own self-interest. When one takes a job, starts a business, and in doing so renders a passion or idea he has into a monetary endeavor, he integrates and accords himself to value in exchange. People become instruments of their own self-preservation, which in turn is the preservation of value and capital. They are forced to play the game, so to say. The social logic of value becomes ingrained in the decision-making processes of individuals. This is what Patrick Murray would call ideal subsumption. The value form shapes our imagination and channels how we think and feel about the world, what we desire, etc. If, for example, you decide to study something that is not ultimately an avenue of making money, you have inevitably been accosted with the, what are you going to do with that? Ideal subsumption is at play here in full effect. And this is a microcosmic example of how social structure pervades and shapes our thoughts. If one studied philosophy in college, this pursuit isn't taken as something worthwhile, as a valid choice for self-interested individuals. This is not necessarily because people find it unimportant in a certain sense, but because it is seen as something that will not render the student a more desirable person on the labor market later on. It is taken as a so-called bad major, but why? Because it cannot service money-making in the same way different fields of study possibly could for the individual. A whole host of social categories and presuppositions are included in that question, what are you going to do with that? But it is almost never thought of in this manner. Subjective reason, then, is present in this microcosm. Why would you do this thing if you won't make money from it, won't further your career, won't be able to make a business out of it? If it can't service value, why bother? The social structure thus imposes determinate forms of thought onto us as individuals. This is inevitable in any system, but capitalism imposes forms of thought in line with the categories of its own social production. In this sense, while the ideals of the Enlightenment are realized in capitalism, in terms of liberty, equality, and self-interest in the marketplace, and in the use of reason in place of appeals to tradition or religious authority, these turn into inversions of themselves. The marketplace's apparent realm of freedom becomes one of abstract social domination, and reason becomes subjective, formal, and instrumental. Reason's purpose is to act as a faculty of capital, which takes the impulses of capital as its end, not humans taken as an end in themselves. In this sense, Enlightenment is both realized, as discussed above, but also totally fails many of its own promises. If Kant is taken as the preeminent philosopher of the Enlightenment, modernity has failed his hopes in the same way it has realized them. Reason, as subjective reason, in the sense discussed above, undermines Kant's whole notion of enlightenment itself. As Kant discusses in his short essay, What is Enlightenment? Enlightenment is taken as, quote, the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority. Minority is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the direction of another. Have courage to make use of your own understanding is the motto of the Enlightenment. He further states that enlightenment is, quote, freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. But as we have seen thus far, this promise is totally undermined by the material mode of life under capitalism. Reason and the understanding, in the Kantian sense of these words, do not act as purely transcendental faculties, free from the social world. They become instead subordinate to it. In science's subsumption into capital as a means of relative surplus value extraction first and foremost, these faculties, along with the so-called free sale of labor power in man's activity generally, become subordinate to an alien power, that of capital. Furthermore, Kant's moral hope that reason concerns itself morally with humans taken as ends in themselves becomes humans as a means to an end of capital. So what is left? If the promises of enlightenment have stalled out in their realization, what is to be done at this point forward? We are faced not only with a society of deep unfreedom, but a world that consistently continues its relentless destruction of nature. If this is the case, are we simply stuck? While we shouldn't be naive to the conditions of what is, we should always maintain the possibility of what could be, and what is posited as a real potential in our current moment. In this light, the task is to grasp the whole of society, understand the ways that objectivity confronts us and dominates us, but also how the possibility of freedom is latent in this objectivity. As Adorno says in Negative Dialectics, the task of theory is to give voice to suffering, and to break through appearances of what seemingly is, to demystify it, and express its unfreedom. But we shouldn't only give voice to suffering, but also possibilities of freedom. That capitalism's dynamic creates the potential of the abolition of proletarian labor, value, and capital, and the realization of a society that has overcome the constraints of a hyper-detailed division of labor, of abstract social domination, and in all of this holds the potential for the realization of the social individual. The current society creates the real possibility of the species as such to be posited in and for itself, freely and consciously carrying out its activity without the constraints and impositions of class, capital, and various other forms of social domination.